In many US enterprises, the economic case for AI does not begin in the lab. It begins in a budgeting room where revenue expectations remain uncertain and cost reduction targets are firm. Leadership teams identify labor as the most visible pressure point on the P and L, particularly in functions where cognitive work repeats at scale. The conclusion forms quickly. Shift that work to AI systems, and output should rise without a corresponding rise in payroll. At first glance, the logic appears unusually clean. Labor scales with demand. Compute should scale with traffic. That is the promise. Yet the economics turn less clean the moment scale stops being hypothetical. What appears to be direct substitution is usually a deeper change in cost physics, one that often proves harder to unwind than the original labor structure. Traditional labor scaling carries a visible, if burdensome, slope. As workload expands, firms add people, hours, training, and supervisory layers. The cost curve rises in a way finance teams can track directly inside quarterly cycles. When volumes soften, hiring can slow and attrition can partially reset the burden. The adjustment remains painful but legible. Even with high turnover and uneven wage pressure common under US conditions, labor cost stays relatively observable. Compute scaling offers a flatter proposition after deployment. Additional output can expand through inference capacity with far lower incremental human involvement. At moderate volumes, this produces genuine variable cost compression. The visible labor line lightens while output grows. The model looks compelling under quarterly budget pressure, where reducing headcount intensity carries immediate appeal. The first tension appears here. The comparison usually pits compute against labor in its most linear form. Against that benchmark, compute appears structurally superior because its marginal cost per unit often looks lower post-deployment. Yet this view discounts the layered dependencies that emerge once systems move into production. Query volumes rise, so do latency demands, data refresh needs, observability requirements, and exception handling logic. What starts as a narrow inference layer quietly pulls broader infrastructure behind it. The unit cost may still decline in the visible layer. The total system cost rarely stays narrow. A simple relationship sketch clarifies the mechanics. Plot output volume on the horizontal axis and total cost on the vertical. The labor-heavy curve climbs at a relatively steady slope, reflecting added compensation and oversight. The compute-augmented curve starts higher due to upfront architecture, integration, and deployment commitments, then flattens more noticeably as volume grows. The crossover point, where compute-supported delivery becomes cheaper, depends critically on utilization rate, review burden, and infrastructure containment. The advantage holds only if utilization remains high enough to absorb infrastructure and oversight cost simultaneously. Many AI systems still require meaningful human oversight for edge cases and accountability, burdens that do not shrink proportionally with volume. Legacy data flows and fragmented processes demand recurring middleware and exception logic, rarely captured in initial models. The advantage remains real in high-volume domains, yet it compresses when secondary layers expand faster than expected. A second tension surfaces in utilization patterns. Compute scaling models often assume steady or rising demand. In practice, US enterprises experience quarterly revenue variability and initiative pauses. Demand softness that labor could absorb through slower hiring now collides with capacity commitments and reserved infrastructure that resist contraction. Effective cost per unit can rise sharply precisely when cost discipline tightens. What registered as variable expense in pilots begins behaving more like semi-fixed cost at scale. This introduces a distinct form of capital lock-in. Labor costs, though visible, can recalibrate through attrition or hiring restraint without large balance sheet write-downs. Compute commitments carry depreciation schedules, technical dependencies, and organizational habits that linger even as immediate output needs soften. The economics favor expansion far more readily than contraction. Further tension emerges in the evolving human layer. As routine workload shifts to AI, the remaining labor does not simply shrink. It becomes more exception-oriented, supervisory, and consequential. Edge cases, auditability, and cross-system judgment grow in importance. The people required to maintain reliability and accountability often command premium compensation in competitive talent markets. Routine labor cost per unit may fall while coordination and oversight cost per unit rises. The gain is genuine in the repeatable domain, yet it migrates into more expensive and persistent forms elsewhere. Cross-department cost allocation distortion adds another layer of friction common in US enterprises. Savings appear in one budget owner's labor line, while new infrastructure and oversight costs land in IT or operations budgets, creating internal tension over who captures the benefit and who absorbs the burden. The compression point clarifies the overall picture. Compute scaling lowers cost where output is consistent and demand sufficient to amortize the system. But the same shift adds infrastructure, integration, monitoring, and high-skill oversight burdens that do not vanish with volume. One slope flattens, several others steepen or become stickier. The net advantage narrows under real enterprise conditions. Legacy drag, utilization volatility, and competitive pricing dynamics that pilots rarely reveal. Finance and strategy teams that evaluate this dynamic effectively trace total delivered cost across the full operating chain rather than isolating cloud spend from labor lines. They stress test the model against realistic volume bands, including downside scenarios common in quarterly reporting cycles. Where secondary burdens dominate, apparent variable relief quietly converts into higher structural commitments that resist unwinding. Returning to the relationship sketch reveals the refined view. The labor curve rises steadily with visible payroll and management drag. The compute curve offers a flatter trajectory after the initial commitment. Yet once integration overhead, oversight intensity, infrastructure persistence, and utilization swings are fully counted, the vertical gap between the curves narrows. The crossover point shifts rightward, and in some configurations it falls outside the practical planning horizon. When those conditions weaken, the cost advantage contracts faster than expected. Understanding these frictions matters as much as understanding the forces. The underlying physics of compute versus labor scaling shapes outcomes more than the technology itself. This is where the economic advantage holds, and where it does not.